I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff.
And I'm Matt Bernico.
And this week on the show, we're talking about the Philippines. We have two great guests, Ariel, a student at the Toronto School of Theology, who is researching Christians for National Liberation, a really neat movement that we have talked about every once in a while on the show, but finally have somebody who knows what they're talking about to piece some of the cool things about them together for us. And also Jeanelle Ablola, the pastor at Pine United Methodist Church. They have done a lot of really great organizing work, solidarity work with people in the Philippines and people in the U.S., and it's really nice to be able to hear from both of them about the history of Christianity and resistance in the Philippines and also the links between that kind of resistance and resistance abroad. So we'll hear a little bit about that history. We'll also hear about what we can do outside of the Philippines in Canada and the U.S. to show solidarity in a very challenging situation.
It's a great episode. You're going to love it. It's really important, I think, in a lot of different ways to have these voices on the show and to kind of explore some of these topics more deeply. So really excited for people to listen to it. But before we get to the show, let me steal you away for a minute. Over here on this side of the podcast room.
Goodbye.
We'll come back to Dean in just a minute, but let me tell you, if you like the Magnificast, you can support us financially by supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. It would be a very cool thing if you did that, but if you can't, that's fine too. We get it. If you do support us on Patreon at the $2 or more level, you get all kinds of great things like access to early episodes, like when we have them, just sometimes. I'm doing a bad sales pitch again. You can also get an invite to our exclusive Discord channel to be a part of the big Magnificast community and talk to other Magnificast people and us and share links and make jokes and have a good time online. And then also you get access to the behind the paywall, Patreon only podcast that Dean and I do every week called The Lock-In. The Lock-In is a current events podcast where we also just make a lot of dumb jokes. So, what's not to like? You get so much in return for supporting us. The money that you might give us does help us pay the bills, and we appreciate it. Okay, I'll stop trying to sell you on this, and we can get back to the episode now. The episode with Ariel and Jeanelle is very cool. Very excited for everyone to listen to it. I do need to flag this right here, though, that the audio is a little bit rough in places. And listen, it's not that bad. You can squint your ears a little bit, and it's fine. Not that big of a deal. But just want to tell you that it's definitely worth sticking with. I think the content is really important. So hopefully some of the spotty audio doesn't deter you too much. But with all that being said, let's go to the podcast.
Thanks for coming on the show, Ariel and Jeanelle. Whenever we have guests on the show, we ask them to do a little introducing of themselves to our audience. So could you start out by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you're interested in?
Oh, thanks for having us. My name is Ariel. I am an ordained minister of the Iglesia United Methodist and Las Islas Filipinas, or the Evangelical Methodist Church in the Philippines. Currently, I am on my second-year doctoral study of theology at Toronto School of Theology. That's what I do mainly. But on the side, I am part of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. We are forming a chapter here in Toronto. iChurch is a global network of organizations concerned about the human rights situation in the Philippines and committed to campaign for just and lasting peace in the country.
I am Jeanelle Ablola, and I am a pastor in the United Methodist Church, currently pastoring in the San Francisco Bay Area and working with the California, Nevada, Philippines Solidarity Task Force of the United Methodist Church. I see myself as an activist rooted in faith, and I do identify with a lot of different intersections. I am Filipino American. I was raised in the U.S. diaspora. My parents immigrated from the Philippines in the early 70s, and that's part of that's part of kind of what brought me to this work of solidarity as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your voices and your expertise on the show. I think the Philippines it's a really fascinating country. It's one that the United States, I think people in the United States know very little about, especially about its current political situation and it's the struggle going on there now. Before we kind of get into the depth of the conversation, would you mind just telling us a little bit about like what's happening in the Philippines now? What's like the main political struggle? What does it look like? What are the moving parts of it? I mean, just broadly, I guess it's a big question, but yeah, as broad as you want to be.
I actually appreciate that question. It's an important question since that provides a pretext and a sort of justification to the ministries of what we're going to talk about, the Christians for National Liberation. So I think when we speak of political background, it is imperative to look at the historical material basis that gives birth to a particular political consciousness. And there are two important conditions which probably will answer the political background that we should take account for the political consciousness arising from the Philippine people. First is the condition of continuing colonialism. We have been colonized by the Spaniards for more than 300 years, then by the United States from 1890 until the so-called independence in 1947. I say so-called because what ended was formal colonialism, but colonialism in essence exists, continue in different forms. Like military bases in the Philippines operated after 1947. Now, military cooperations between the Philippines and the U.S. is in the form of visiting forces agreements. And of course, we take into consideration the mechanisms of globalization that extends the colonial rule of the U.S., well, not just in the Philippines, but also in countries vulnerable to their offers. So that's one condition. The second condition is the condition of poverty that informs and shapes a political background. The majority of the people live in poverty, mostly are in rural areas where they farm the land they are not able to own. In urban areas right now, workers are swarming in foreign companies since the Philippines does not have a national industry. So it is highly dependent on foreign investments and labor experts. As you would notice, there are large numbers of Filipino diaspora in Canada, well, all over the world. In the Philippines, labor export is a national program where you send your people in affluent societies such as Canada so that they can send money back home. So the condition of colonialism and continuing colonialism and the condition of poverty forms this political background. We have a government tied and committed to the interests of their foreign masters. We have politicians who came from the old rich background who would rather not have change a thing, meaning they are not concerned with land reform and forming national industries because they benefit from the present structure of things. And we have a population experiencing poverty. Maybe an introduction, CNL member operates from a political consciousness aware of these two conditions and aware and participating on a way out of these conditions. Maybe Jeanelle could add some things about the current political situation.
Yeah, along with what Ariel had mentioned, is also just the history of people in the Philippines rising up for their liberation and for self-determination, and how historically that's been met with ire from the government, ire from those who benefit from the interests that Ariel had raised as well. Currently, there's or actually in 2020, that there was an anti-terror law that was passed in the Philippines that basically put it into law that the security of the Philippines would be allowed to go after those who are seen as quote unquote terrorists, those who are who speak out against the government, those who show any dissent against the government as well. And this red tagging, it's not a new thing, but to have it put into law with very vague and very broad stipulations and means for implementation is very dangerous. I mean, some people call it terror tagging, right? Because we say that it's based on terrorism, and that happened in after 9/11. The Philippines became the second front on the war on terror, and so people were using the label of terrorist in order to silence dissent, and now they're also using the label of communist to silence dissent as well. And folks who have been, red tagging has escalated, especially since the passing of the ATL, or the anti-terror law, and it costs people their lives. It can, just this week, I saw that there had been a lawyer that had been killed, and a lawyer that was previously working on a case for human rights and for someone who was also red tagged and killed as well. So we can't really underestimate the severity of the situation, of the harassment of activists and harassment of human rights defenders. On top of that, I also wanted to add that there is a Philippine National Police outpost in the Philippine consulate in San Francisco, and we have yet to know why they're there and what they're doing, but it's hard for us to not think about how the red tagging may be also implemented through that outpost. And this isn't something new, right?
Yeah.
There are Filipino activists in the U.S. Who were killed during anti-Marcos times, or for their anti-Marcos activism, and they were Filipinos who were living in Washington State. So the red tagging is worldwide for us because of the diaspora.
That's such a, obviously a very troubling situation, but just a really challenging one to get our heads around as well, that that kind of red tagging, as you're putting it, would, not just be enclosed into the borders of the Philippines, but has worldwide consequences. We definitely want to hear more about the Christians for National Liberation, which I know have something to do with that red tagging story back in the anti-Marcos period as well. Maybe before we get into that, could you tell us a little bit more about what red tagging does in terms of sort of disciplining or policing all kinds of people, whether they're communist or not communist at all? And does that sort of shape the way that people organize in the solidarity movement or organize within the Philippines?
When someone is red tagged, they are more or less susceptible to harassment and vilification, and that of course prevents someone's participation, and that leaves a mark or a trauma to the population. It's a way of, as you say, Dean, it's a way of disciplining the society and the population.
And does that sort of shape maybe how people organize or are willing to put themselves out there, or afraid of that even internationally at all?
Yeah, I think that it sows a lot of fear, and also I think that sometimes the public believes it, and I think that can be dangerous in regards to just not harassment and being outcast. Not just harassment from the military and the police, but also like outcast from the community, or not being able to see your family or be with your family because of the possible dangers that that red tagging has. Like, people are being followed, people are having threatening texts sent to them and random phone calls because of this red tagging. And so there's a lot of having to make extra precautions, I think, in people's safety. Yeah. So in general, it's making people more cautious in doing that work and sowing more fear. And the thing is that it's kind of, in some cases, like in the case of Jory Porquia, who was killed last year, he was simply providing aid in helping feed folks during the pandemic, and he was then killed for that. He has been involved in activism for a while, but those were the acts that he was engaged in before he was killed.
It's an incredibly troubling thing. It's a disgusting thing to target activists like that. I think that's well, I mean, to understate it, it's very bad. Well, maybe we can shift the conversation just slightly here, or kind of put some of the pieces here that we've been talking about already into context. Ariel, we originally wanted to have you on the show to talk about one of your academic interests, which is the Christians for National Liberation. Maybe we can kind of get the ball rolling here, just with you describing what the organization is and how it started. Maybe some things about the history there.
Sure. So the Christians for National Liberation, or the CNL, was founded at the worship room of Sampaloc University Center in Manila on February 17, 1972. On the anniversary of the martyrdom of priest Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora. So the initial members of the CNL were 72 people whom they called themselves Revolutionary Disciples of Christ. They gathered to bear the quote-unquote cross of sacrifice and quote-unquote raise the red banner of revolution. The immediate context that gave birth to CNL is the rapidly growing discontent of the Filipino people with their economic and political life. Many were poor. Those who live in rural areas where most of the means of living is by farming have to grapple with the situation that though they have plowed the land for many years, they still do not have the means to own them. So large tracts of land, which are called hacienda, were owned by elite families. So at that time, young people were lured to go to urban areas to join the industrializing cities, but only to be disappointed by the dismal situation of work environment and scarcity of opportunity for employment. So at that time, when social unrest erupts, becomes violent, there were numerous rallies staged by the working class, but they were confronted by guns and violence by the government. The years preceding the founding of CNL is the most tumultuous years of that period in Philippine history. So that's the immediate context of the formation of CNL. While looking from a broader view, the historical formation of CNL can be considered a culmination of a long tradition of defiance against colonial rule, organized by church people. The CNL claimed to trace its roots from the martyrdom of the three priests, and this martyrdom happened during the Spanish colonial rule in the Philippines due to charges of subversion arising from the rebellion of the Tagalog in Cavite in 1872. So there's a long history and tradition of Filipino church people defying colonialism. Like in 1902, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente of the Philippine Independent Church was formed as a protest against the Spanish control of the Roman Catholic Church. On a similar move, the Emily Church, my church, was founded mostly against the U.S. colonial rule, particularly the rule of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Notably, the founders of these two churches were also organizers of workers' union too. So we see at this early in history that a consciousness that is both religious and political is made possible. Isabelo de los Reyes is a labor leader, while the group Ang Katotohanan, or in Tagalog it's called The Truth, were anti-Spanish, anti-American colonial rule, and themselves organizers of the working class. So CNL is a culmination of the anti-colonial and nationalistic aspirations of the Filipino church people, but it is also a beginning of a new mode of doing Christianity in relation to work of transformation. The CNL is working on the analysis that the suffering of the Filipino people are brought about by imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. This I saw on their website. It's so the project is quote unquote a new democratic revolution that aims to overthrow the anti-imperialist comprador landlord rule. I know from documentary and from stories I hear, because I'm researching on this group as part of my academic work, and I found out that none of you have joined who gave up their priestly garbs and clerical collars in exchange of guns to join the armed struggle waged in the countryside. One particular film where I saw some friends whom I was surprised to see in the documentary is maybe our listeners would be interested to see Revolution Selfie. You can Google it. I saw friends in the documentary who plays political and education officers in the battalion. I think one of the passageway for the church people to join the revolution is through the CNL.
It's a really fascinating, initiation into the CNL and what it is and kind of what it's all about. That's really helpful. At the very beginning of our conversation, you mentioned, the relationship between the material conditions sort of dictating the form of struggle. And in the story, you're talking about the ways that, church people got involved in that struggle as well. And I think that is something that for people in North America is probably kind of surprising. With some exceptions, Christianity is, pretty reactionary, pretty right wing in the United States and in Canada. So I don't know what is it about Christianity and church people in the Philippines that would lead them to the struggle for liberation rather than something else. Obviously the colonial situation is probably a big factor, but is there anything else?
I think given that almost 95% of the population in the Philippines identifies themselves as Roman Catholics, it is inevitable to have Christian organizations as part of the revolutionary movement. Not only it is functional in terms of popularization of the values and programs of the belligerent group. Not only it's functional and it's bringing people into the fold, but also it is something that inevitably could happen given the religious background of the Philippines. And a lot about transformative work is cultural work. Generally speaking, a Christian organization provides a cultural framework and orientation to the work of a political organization. Make sure that the political program adheres to the religious program for social transformation. It also makes sure that the political language is translated into theological language, which is more accessible to the Filipino consciousness. So, to answer your question, something about the religious background, which is, of course, tied to the colonial background of the Filipino people, that made them more lured or attracted to joining such a group as a CNL, as a revolutionary.
Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful, Ariel. Jeanelle, I'm curious too, maybe about how this feeds into your own experience as a person in ministry. Also interested in solidarity, formed in that diasporic community. What do you think as a person doing this kind of work, Christianity and solidarity work, how does Christianity sort of feed into that kind of activism?
Yeah. So I appreciate everything that Ariel has said about, I guess, the role of Christians in organizing in general and Christians being part of movements for liberation in general, because as you know, and as your listeners know, that Christians have a mandate to care for the poor and the oppressed, and throughout all different sectors of the population. So for myself to be able to witness that in this movement work has been really, has rooted me and given me a lot of grounding. The more I learn about the Philippines and the movement there for human rights and liberation, the more easily I can have some basic analysis of the presence and mechanisms of U.S. imperialism and the struggles of others in other parts of the world. And so I don't feel like I've had to start from scratch because of it, because of being immersed in Philippines work. So to learn about a situation is a little bit, I feel like it's there are so many similarities between how people are impacted by these, by these oppressive systems. It's allowed me to also immerse with the masses. So there are times when I've been able to join and also help to co-lead medical missions, solidarity missions to the Philippines on a regular basis. And by doing that, I've been allowed to build connections and relationships of care that cross borders, that cross oceans. And this relationship building has been crucial in solidarity building here in the U.S. Because, U.S. mainstream church is so individualistic and very speaks very much to the middle class, that to be able to speak on relationships in a way from firsthand experience, it helps me to challenge folks, church folks. It helps me to also support in broadening their consciousness, and it helps me to connect with others who are interested in something bigger than an individualistic, personal type of faith. To have stories and experiences and relationships with the empowered poor, the empowered masses, it brings an authority based on relationships and genuine care versus just going back over conversations or going back and forth over ideology. And it's also helped me bring the perspective of internationalism to the ministry that I do. Very often am I met with lay people who've, gone to churches that are very U.S. centric in the ways that they view struggle and liberation, but to be able to bring like the connections of how all of these struggles are connected has been beneficial, I think, in my being able to pastor both folks in my church and in the community.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that bit with us. I mean, you can start to see the ways that solidarity work really does lend itself to Christianity, or maybe it lends itself to rehabilitating some forms of Christianity. It's really easy to see how it's so important, I think. And man, I hope U.S. Christians figure this out and hope we can maybe pull them along a little bit. Well, this is, I guess, kind of shifting gears a little bit here. On our podcast, just kind of in line with what we are interested in, we end up talking a lot about liberation theology, and that's cool, but really located specifically to Latin America, or at least mostly. But theologians in the Philippines have also developed what they call a theology of struggle, which is, I think, shares some important resonances with the themes of liberation theology. So I don't know, would you both mind maybe saying something a little bit more about that? How do these two traditions, relate to one another? What's different about them?
Sure. So they are liberation theology and the theology of struggle they are similar in many ways, like the use of Marxist class analysis and historical dialectical materialism, which are common features of these two theologies. Early articulators of the theology of struggle, like Louis Hechanova, Feliciano Carino of the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, and Ed de la Torre, former priest, pointed out that the difference is on the focus. Surely, they recognize that the end point of the theology of struggle is liberation, but the focus is on the struggle. It allows that the emphasis is on the struggle, not the end point. It recognizes that the struggle will be protracted and long. They said that the term struggle evokes participation and an invitation to a new kind of spirituality. It also encourages conversion from mere Christianity to socially engaged practice of one's faith. To some degree, the term makes way for contingencies that could be negotiated and considered. Both theology of struggle and liberation theology, at least in the books that I have read about them, I mean, you could. It is noticeable that both theology of struggle and liberation theology rejected any form of the use of violence. So certainly, it is not the theology of struggle and the liberation theology that CNL uses as a framework. There must be something else, and that is what I'm trying to research about: how CNL reconciles violence in spite of the Christian faith. There must be some other theological framework by which CNL stands.
That's really interesting. And I think, I guess I've never really put it that simply of in my brain of one focusing kind of on the long-term protracted struggle, and one liberation theology maybe sometimes being putting you in a more sort of future state. But then recognizing that these are still similar things, I think is really helpful. Jeanelle, do these things maybe feed into your ministry as well? I mean, there's a long tradition of liberation theology in the U.S., not only in dialogue with Latin America, but also Black liberation theology, indigenous feminist theologies, etc. Is there a way that that kind of theological tradition that's happening in the U.S., do you find that sort of relating to your experience in solidarity work with the Philippines? Like, I'm really intrigued by, you said some of that solidarity work has helped you have a different view of, or a deeper view of U.S. imperialism. Do you find these kind of theological traditions all mixing up together in your ministry, or not so much? How does that all come together for you?
Yeah, I see that the theology of struggle has been helpful, I think, for many Filipinos in the diaspora, especially the ones that are born in diaspora and are trying to search for a sense of identity. And oftentimes the ones that I meet are ones that are exploring both their Christian identity and their identity as Filipino, and it's kind of hard to separate the two. So theology of struggle is helpful in the sense that it's like, along with the struggle, it's about developing the consciousness that there is a need to struggle and that there's a reason for struggle in the first place. And I think that sometimes living in the diaspora, we're given messages that we should be grateful that we're here and not in the Philippines. We should be grateful that we're living in the so-called first world. But I think theology of struggle speaks to the fact that there's still dissonance that people experience, that Filipino Americans might experience when they're here. There's still a sense of loss. There's still a sense of not finding a sense of rootedness. And if people have some kind of solid sense of who they are as a person of faith, to enrich it by being able to bring about how the Filipino consciousness and the work of decolonizing is connected, is I think very empowering for Filipinos abroad.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I mean, the struggle is, of course, the struggle for human rights and for liberation, but it's also it takes on a larger sense of struggle when it comes to the diaspora community. It's really fascinating. Ariel, this is another question for you, I guess. In some of your academic work, you were able to interview Luis Haladone, who is a former priest who started, or who helped start the CNL, and that's really fascinating. I don't know. I've read a bit about him, but what's he like in person? How do they talk about the movement? What do they think of the current situation?
They were, but for one, they are humans. Looking at them from where I came from, I was looking from them from the Philippines, and they were in Utrecht, Netherlands. I was thinking they were superhuman. But when I encountered them, when I visited Utrecht in what they call barangay, or the office of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, they were accommodating. They sing in the karaoke, and so they're human. Let me say something first about contradictions between communists and being a Christian, because I am thinking that because many people think Christianity and communism are contradictory. They do not fit each other. I actually believe that there may still be contradictions between Christianity and communism. It's not a perfect fit. It has many loose ends and digressions to each other. But I don't think that the loose ends need tying up, or they need to be coherent. In real life, we live in different contradictions without us having to feel that they need to be coherent or tied up. Real life is messy just as our ideologies are messy. I think it's productive to live in that place in between these contradictions and embrace it as a way of life. Because on the ground, they live and practice it. I think the CNL is still grappling and navigating these contradictions. scholars' project is to tie them up and produce a coherent body of knowledge. But on the ground, they are at ease with living these two contradictions. Dean shared to me a web page about CNL, announcing that next year they will release a statement on the communist project in relation to Christian beliefs. I am actually excited about the process of their study and its outcome, and I can't wait how they would frame these seeming contradictions. My guess is that they will draw a lot from the practice and the material basis of the struggle. And I also think that they will have to frame it as a revolutionary violence, which sounds more legitimate and popular. And also, since we're on the topic of being a Christian and being a communist, it actually reveals a thing about the dominant view on Christianity and capitalism. It seems that majority of Christians are at home inhabiting this coherence of living in a capitalist world and being a Christian. And it's productive to think about how Christianity is being domesticated in this capitalist framework, and that why it is not viewed as contradictory, but rather one as a whole, as a coherent whole. So yeah, when I went to Utrecht and met Kalui and Kajoma, I was starstruck, to be honest, because they were big people back in the Philippines. I only see them on TV in the news, and having met them face to face is something magical. And I met them at the anniversary of the Communist Party because I was in Europe at that time, and I have Schengen visa, so I contacted the office to interview Kalui. Kalui has the clearest memory for his age. I asked that I interview him. My laptop's memory actually gave up because we spent almost 2 whole days talking to each other. I don't intend to do it that long, but because he feels the need to share to me a lot of information, which I actually seized. We spent almost 2 days, 2 full days talking to each other. Just to give you a background, Kalui came from a haciendero family, the ones that oppress and exploit farmers back then. He told me a lot of stories that led him to be converted from being a priest to being a comrade in the struggle. And one of those moments was when farmers who were rallying to demand an increase in their wages were dispersed by paramilitary groups of their family. He was from Bacolod, the sugarcane capital of the country, so there are many farmers. And the experience and exposure to death of activists led him to believe and to go to the countryside, gave up his priestly office and joined the armed struggle in the countryside. So similarly, Kajoma, just like Kalui, is very human. He sings in the karaoke. His favorite song is "I Did It My Way," or do you know the song "My Way"? I don't know who's the original singer, but he used to sing it a lot. He would replace "My Way" with Mao's way, meaning Mao Zedong's methodology. So that's something revealing to me how human they are.
That's very funny and very amazing. What a good story. It's really neat to be able to have that window into their life and to some of the conversation between Christianity and communism that's happening on the ground in the Philippines that way. So thanks for that, Ariel. Maybe still thinking about that theme and also that solidarity movement more broadly, something Jeanelle said a little while back earlier in the conversation was that point about how the solidarity movement just lends to a different view of, international relationships, imperialism, etc. And I was thinking about that as you were talking, Ariel, about different views of Christianity and communism too, and maybe what people's impressions of that relationship might be in a place like the United States. So maybe you could both talk a little bit more about that. Like, how does learning about the struggle in the Philippines and the history and people like Luis Alandone and others, how does learning about that, participating in that struggle, also help you have a sort of different view of the United States and its society and its relationship to the rest of the world? Maybe Canada too, Ariel, since you're studying here and thinking about that. How does that struggle sort of help us understand, from the other side, looking from the Philippines outward, what's going on in this part of the world?
I guess this solidarity work has given me a different perspective on where power is, and not necessarily putting all my hope in a parliamentary struggle, but being able to put hope in the folks who are organizing at the grassroots level, folks who are, working with community and trying to build something different, while at the same time trying to oppose these systems of oppression. To be able to see how people in the diaspora, how our life in the diaspora is influenced and impacted by the history and the current situation of the Philippines, I think has been very, very crucial in just seeing how connected we are as a world. And also like to see how oppressive systems are, they're doing the work of transcending borders. They're doing the work of, doing best practice trainings through things like Urban Shield, through sharing policing tactics all over the world. And for us to match that, I guess, with our liberation work, to be able to transcend our ideas of borders and to be able to make connections in those ways, I think would allow us to engage in the struggle for liberation differently. I feel like we're doing things to address our basic needs, and raising consciousness about who we are as Filipinos, worldwide, and I guess reminding folks that we are Filipino and that there's something powerful about that, and that there's something empowering about that. Our colonialism, the colonial psyche in the Filipinx community is very strong, and to be able to use that as a way of to recognize that we are also oppressed and exploited, and that Christians are also oppressed and exploited by these systems, then we get to fight for our collective liberation in a way that's very different, in a way that's empowering, and not in a way that's about charity, but in a way where it's like we all have a stake in this struggle. We all have a stake in this fight. And so, I guess that's how I've been able to see the connections a little bit more broadly, that we as people, we as humans, we're created to connect in ways that transcend all of those things anyway. We're built to be able to have our hearts break for one another. We're built to be able to be in sorrow and enjoy with one another, and that shouldn't be bound by any identities, by any borders or anything like that. And so in that spirit, I feel like it's us being human to and followers of Christ to be able to rise up for one another.
Yeah, Jeanelle, I think that's a really good word. I appreciate what you're saying there. Something that you said, I think, really resonates with me. I mean, in my experience with Christianity in the United States, when it comes to helping somebody else, or even in the most basic ways, it is always viewed through that lens of charity. And I think that's too bad, because I think what you're offering in the ministry that you're doing, and like what you're saying here, is that there's something deeper to Christianity than charity. That practicing solidarity is does some of that work. I don't know, like what would you say to U.S. Christians who don't really even understand what solidarity is? Like, how would you maybe get them into that mind frame of thinking about the relationships between people, and especially people across borders? Like, how would you provoke U.S. Christians to think more deeply about solidarity?
Okay, Jenna, would you like to answer?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm thinking charity is built in the system. I mean, charity is built in the system of oppression itself. You oppress the people, and there's a way, and they're in the same system, in the same structure of things that charity is made available to. And one of the ways to challenge it is to propose the idea of justice and structural justice at that, when we remove the oppression, because the same people who are oppressing, for example, the Philippines, are also the same people who made charity possible. So one of the ways to challenge that is to put justice discourse into the structure, and to imagine the structure, or to reimagine the structure in a way that it dispenses justice rather than charity.
Yeah, I think that in the U.S., it does have to do with how some people also self-identify. I remember listening to Hy Thurman, who worked alongside Fred Hampton, and he said that one of the struggles that he had was getting poor white folk to recognize that they were poor, and in being able for folks to recognize that they're not the ones with, private jets and stuff like that they're able to identify then with those who they're closest to in terms of like material need and, access to resources and stuff like that. And so I think that Christians in the U.S., we've attached so strongly to the charity aspect that there's also a lot of shame that in receiving charity as well. I have heard of church people where they had set up charity, they had set up maybe like clothing donations for folks, but then when a member, is in need, that sometimes that shame of being the person in need overrides being able to receive that resource. So it's interesting how that happens. I was also in a conversation with some API trans community. We were trying to assess our needs, and we found, and some of the surveys that they had conducted found that many Asian American trans folks, I also identify as trans as well, but they often feel like they're too privileged to access resources that are available to them. So I feel like there's a sense of not identifying with those who need and people in need. And I think that impacts how deeply we might engage in struggles, and also it might impact how we even are able to resource ourselves and one another.
Yeah, that is really helpful and makes a lot of sense. And I feel like Christianity probably has a unique role in creating those kinds of bad habits, and also maybe a unique role in trying to undo them, or think a little more broadly about how to create a different paradigm for that. So yeah, all of what you're both saying gives me a lot to think about there. As we're sort of moving toward the back half of this episode, we've been covering a lot of ground. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more toward the end about solidarity movements that are kind of sprouting up or seems like gaining more steam in the U.S. and Canada with the people of the Philippines, and how Christians or others in these countries might be able to participate. So, there are a lot of international solidarity movements. You're both involved in them. How can Christians outside the Philippines express their solidarity with the people there? What can we do in these countries in order to, make a material impact on that kind of situation?
Here in Canada, we receive like the NCCP, or the National Council of Churches in the Philippines, which is more in tune with the suffering of the Filipino people, is in partnership with here in Canada with United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada, and those partnerships were started long ago, and people here in Canada are able to participate through those partnerships. yeah, so that's how solidarity work function and operates here in Canada to the Philippines, or in solidarity with the Filipino people. So that's church is one way, one of the ways in which people here can participate in solidarity work. Another way is like here in Toronto, we have Migrante Toronto, we have International Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, and we have Bayan Canada, which are activist organizations that 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 is connected with Filipino activism in the Philippines. So yeah, in church, for church people, there are venues of participation. For those who are not inclined to go to church, there are people's organization and movements that they could participate in and learn something from. I know for sure that these organizations are like Migrante Ontario and Bayan Canada and Anak Bayan Toronto and International iChurch Toronto are conducting education sessions to bring people in and to make people aware of the situation in the Philippines, and that is letting us know that here in Canada we are living, or in Canada and the US we are living in the belly of the empire, and that a lot of mechanisms. There are a lot of mechanisms, legal ones, that can be used in order to do something and to express solidarity with the Filipino people. For example, writing to politicians. I think many activists are doing that here in Canada. So those are just a few of the ways different people could join in the struggle and in solidarity with.
Jeanelle, any advice for people in the United States?
The organizations that Ariel had lifted up, there are U.S. chapters, and I also want to lift up the National Alliance for Filipino Concerns. They have something called the Filipino American Agenda right now that speaks broadly to different things that impact the Filipino American communities, like workers, women, LGBTQ plus. And there's also an item on there around foreign policy. And so I would encourage folks to make connections, build relationships with organizations that are addressing the needs of Filipinos in America, and also making the connections to Filipino workers, migrants, and Filipinos abroad. I also do want to lift up that I feel like there's always an invitation when we have our events and when we have our gatherings to allies, for folks to join us in solidarity. And I think that the question of what can we do or what can be done comes up pretty often. And I think that simply when our communities ask folks to come and be present, I think it's simply that, to come and be present, to build relationships, to get to know folks on a personal level as well as a political level. I think that part of what folks can do as well, many of these organizations also have solidarity trips or immersion trips. And once in a while, our task force, who also partners with NCCP, once in a while we ask NCCP whether it's better for us to just fundraise, because it's a lot of resources that go into getting folks to go on these trips, whether we should just send the funds that we would use to go on the trips. But they always say that we should go there to build relationships, to witness for ourselves the situation that is happening in the Philippines and the realities there. So I think relationship building is very crucial. And that's really why we want folks to join organizations, right? Is to build those kind of relationships.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds like a really neat thing. We'll do our best to list some of these organizations that you all are mentioning in the notes of our show. But maybe to close the conversation out, just a very broad question. We end up usually asking this to most people, but I think it'll be especially interesting to hear from you both. what do you want Christians in the U.S. and Canada to know about the struggle for liberation in the Philippines more broadly? At the very top of the episode, I mentioned that people in the U.S. I think the Philippines is a blind spot for sure. So I don't know. What would you want them to know? Also, what would you want the U.S. left to know about the struggle in the Philippines? What would you try to urge us to learn about these movements and the way they intersect?
Thank you for that. That's an important question. I would like to share that to the activists here that they would understand the sense of urgency that our activism brought us. I mean, the sense of urgency to change and be changed. It's more intense in the Philippines. It's intense in the Philippines in such a way that exploitation is more felt, and that requires an immediate, urgent response of action. And second, that leftist activism in the Philippines is not a career path, but more of a calling. And the ultimate expression of that calling is to join in the armed revolution, which requires that you give up every other desires and have it under the desire of the project of the party or project of the movement.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel. That is really helpful. And Jeanelle, anything that you wish more Christians in the U.S. or Canada knew about the Philippines or the left, how they might, what you wish they might know about that struggle, what it might tell us?
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that it's it's intentional that we don't know what's going on in the Philippines. I think that we need to remember that it's not because things are not happening there. It's because that information is being kept from us. The people that are who are trying to expose these things, those folks are being intentionally silenced. And I think that's important to remember, that this increasing the lack of information and also the increasing fascist policies like the Antiterror law show how powerful the movement for liberation really is in the Philippines, that there's so much effort to silence it, and there's so much effort to make folks not know that that folks are rising up in liberation. I also want to note that folks that I have met there in the Philippines, activists I've met there in the Philippines, have said that loosening the foothold of U.S. empire in the Philippines contributes to loosening the foothold of U.S. empire everywhere. And so I think more so our solidarity work is crucial. If we're able to loosen that foothold of empire in any place, that it helps all of us collectively. And I hope that we can all recognize and remember always our unity and our collective struggle.
Thanks. That's a great note to end on. I think a good pastoral call as well. So it's great to be able to have that that sort of spirit represented in this conversation. So thanks to both of you, Ariel, especially for sharing your knowledge of the CNL. We'd love to hear more about that in the future, maybe next year when they celebrate their 50th anniversary. And Jeanelle, so wonderful to hear more about your work and your experience and life in the struggle. We'd love to hear more about that as well down the line. So great to have you both on the Magnificast. We look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, like we said at the top of the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also check our show notes. We are going to list some of the organizations that you heard about in the last hour or so. You can also talk to us on Twitter at The Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. There's probably more you can do, but I can't think of it right now. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong in the beginning and by the Illogical Spoon here at the end. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early.